the early childhood series here. Today we're going to have Brian Lightsgate, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about his research and some of the things that he's done in the past and what's coming up. He's interested in how our early experiences affect the way we process emotion and understand it in context and with cues and things like that. And then when some of that early stuff falls apart, there's an opportunity for intervention and how that can all work itself out. So,
okay, thank you very much.
Turn over to you, Brian. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Talk at this level? Okay. So, I know that, show of hands, who read the paper that was sent out? Excellent. All right, good. The less the better. The paper I definitely talk about, but the general topic kind of goes in a different direction. And so not reading the paper doesn't really make a difference in this case, but I will touch on some of the data that was in there. So this talk is about early experiences in emotion recognition, and I'm going to narrow down those early experiences to be child maltreatment and early life stress. And I'm going to talk about how some of the impacts that child maltreatment has on people's emotional perception and recognition might actually also be an opportunity for intervention. Emotion recognition broadly, it's important for a lot of things. It's important for forming relationships. We know that it's important for identifying what other people are feeling so we can respond. It's important for us to regulate our own emotions so then we can have appropriate behaviors in social settings and for social functioning. And we also know that this emerges really early in life. We know that babies, even very young infants, orient to faces. There's studies showing that this happens within hours of birth. We know that infants can discriminate faces of people that they know from what they don't know. We know that by 5 months they can categorize different emotional expressions. And this continues to develop throughout childhood. The important part about this is that as we gain these abilities to recognize and perceive emotions, it allows us to start building that into more advanced abilities. So our abilities to understand what other people feel allows us to then respond in turn. So with empathic responding, to comfort other people, to console. That's something that happens because of our earlier abilities in recognizing what people feel first. Social referencing, so understanding what we should and shouldn't do. The classic studies with social referencing is seeing a mother who has a fearful face, and infants recognize that very early on and know to guide their behavior to either stop or to proceed based on those references. And this is going to help later on through early childhood and adolescence and even adulthood on establishing and maintaining relationships. These skills are something that develop, and they're important for a lot of aspects of our functioning. So naturally, if you have poor abilities to recognize emotions, this is going to play out in a lot of different ways. You're going to have potentially more difficulties with relationships, fewer friendships, you get social ostracization, fights, things like that. And we also see some of these deficits in all sorts of disorders. It goes across the board. We know that people with autism tend to have struggles with emotion recognition and social functioning. And you see this in issues with depression and anxiety and many other psychiatric disorders, conduct disorder, antisocial, all sorts of stuff. So the reason that I bring this up is because this development and this trajectory is both the curse in that it makes functioning later in life more difficult, but it also provides a really interesting opportunity for intervention that has just been coming up over the last decade or so. So the development, we know this from a lot of reasons. I mean, I showed some of the data before, but we know that emotion recognition develops because of developmental research showing the longitudinal effects of this, and we also know that from cultural differences, we see this as well. So a study that we did in our lab was looking at how people attended to facial expressions when they were in different contexts. So in this particular study, we had this matrix of angry faces on the top and disgust faces on the bottom, which look pretty similar. And then angry contexts and disgust contexts. So you get the congruent and incongruent context face combinations. And what we did is we had different age kids, 4-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and adults, sit down and free look at these expressions. And we used eye tracking to see how much time they spent looking at faces versus contexts. We had the face on the bottom and then the context congruent versus incongruent on the just right above that. And in this case, it barely even matters what we're talking about. What you can see is a pretty clear trajectory of how much time people spend looking at the face, with adults spending, sorry, I'm going to go to the left here too. More time on the face means less time on the context. And so we see that adults across the board, regardless of the congruence or what's in the context, are spending a considerable more amount of time looking at faces. The 4-year-olds, especially when, in this case, an angry face in incongruent context is a disgust context. Same thing with a disgust face in a congruent context, also a disgust context. The 4-year-olds are spending basically equal time looking at faces versus contexts. And so we see this developmental trajectory of the prioritization and importance of facial emotion versus contextual stuff. So we see that this goes through adolescence and into adulthood. But it's not just how much time people spend looking at faces, it's also just the strategies people use to identify and process faces. So the two strategies that are typically identified are holistic and analytical processing. The holistic processing is using the whole face to make judgments and decisions about what someone's feeling, using their mouth, using their eyes, and potentially even incorporating some sort of contextual information. Analytical is what we do typically see with much younger children, where they're looking at just single features. And they have tests where you can test what people are using, and it works really well with upright versus inverted faces, because inverted faces are very difficult to process holistically when we're used to seeing faces upright. So you tend to look at mouth regions individually, or eye regions individually, or even the brow region to try to figure out what people are feeling. So what this study did was showed different age groups, upright and inverted faces, and tested whether they were analyzing these analytically or holistically. So what we have is the percentage of time that people of different ages use analytical versus holistic processing. And one of the key things you can see is that until you get to the adults, for upright only, almost everybody uses, 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds use analytical processing more than holistic processing. The inverted one, again, we see this in adults, that it's difficult to process an inverted face holistically. You can also see the developmental trajectory going from age 7 into adulthood of the way they're processing this. They gradually increase the amount that they use holistic versus analytical processing. So we know that the strategies that are used to examine them change. And then I'm not going to show the data here, but we also have neural evidence that shows that the way that the brain processes emotional expressions also changes across childhood and adolescence, and it doesn't look like adulthood until actually late adolescence. In addition to developmental research, we also have cross-cultural research. And the reason I bring this up is that by looking at the way people in different cultures with different social upbringing and social experiences process and identify and recognize emotions shows this idea of learning and experience and how this applies to our emotional and social recognition and functioning. So in this study, they took Japanese individuals and Americans, and they showed them faces that differed in emotion between the eyes and the mouth. So on the left, the eyes are always a slightly more positively valenced emotion than the mouth. And what they found was that Japanese individuals tended to rate these faces as happier than Americans, when the eyes were more happy than the mouth. The flip side of that is when the mouth was actually happier than the eyes, Americans tended to interpret those as more happy than Japanese individuals. One of the theories behind this is that American culture is one that has a more overt expressions in the mouth than some Eastern cultures, and so we tend to prioritize those features of the face more than other cultures might. And so again, it shows how these early experiences with emotion expression and emotional interactions guide how we perceive them later. We also have evidence that the words people use in different cultures change just to describe different emotions. So the classic Paul Ekman work from the 1960s. What he did is he went into Papua New Guinea and he tried to test natives who had no experience with Western media, newspapers, movies, or anything like that, and he tested how they described emotional facial expressions. And he developed a universal emotion hypothesis that people all across the world universally use very similar terms and identify the same facial expressions in similar ways. That's been recently a little bit more challenged, and this is one study that shows some cultural differences in how people just freely describe emotional expressions. On the descriptors here, you have behavioral words or other emotion words, or the specific emotion words that we use in America: anger, fear, sadness, disgust, or neutral and happiness. Those specific words, we call them the basic emotions. You can see that in the American free sort, where people just saw faces and freely labeled them, the vast majority of the time they're using those types of words to describe facial expressions. But in this Himba free sort, which was actually a pre-literate culture in Africa, they much more were likely to use behavioral words than those specific words. And even though maybe those are somewhat comparable, they didn't use the emotion words nearly as much as Americans did. And so when we have these... Huh?
Did they have emotion?
They do, and they actually did a pretty good job of trying to translate that. They don't have every emotion word, but you can make a basis on whether or not the word conforms to an emotion category, so if it's a happiness type word. The interesting part with the behavioral words is instead of saying emotions like happy and anger, which they have some of, it was more feeling like running away, that kind of description. So if you see a scared face, it's like feeling like running away, so behavior. So this little bit of research shows that there's developmental and cross-cultural research that's supporting this idea of the impact of social experiences and learning on the development of emotion perception and emotion recognition. This plays into this general model of kind of an iterative cycle throughout development between our functioning, social and emotional functioning, and in this case they call it affect-biased orienting, so attention-biased orienting, how we attend to emotional expressions, and then how we generally attend to things in our environment. And there's an interaction between these three things that across development strengthens based on our experiences. Thinking about those experiences, though, this is where I get into some of the research that I'm a little bit more interested in, and that's picking out experiences that are different than the norm. And in this case, it's child maltreatment. Child maltreatment is different in a lot of ways. It's different in the experiences that kids have, both physically and emotionally, and it's also different in the early emotional environments that they're in. Intuitively, abusive environments are going to have a greater proportion of negative to happy emotions than non-abusive environments. The prevalence is a lot higher than we like. Right now, this is the 2014 data that's showing a few million referrals across the United States. And of those, a lot of those are neglect, but there's still roughly 17 to 18% of kids in this sample that are experiencing physical abuse, and roughly a quarter of people experience some sort of maltreatment in their entire life. So it's not necessarily a really small group. It's a little bit larger than we'd hope. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study kind of mapped out a framework for how some of those early experiences then go on to later outcomes. So those adverse child experiences in the bottom can lead to disrupted neurodevelopment. It leads to changes in our social and emotional functioning, which then you can kind of predict the cascade that's going to come with this. And this is exactly what they found. This study analyzed over 17,000 healthcare workers through the Kaiser Permanente organization, asking them about their behaviors and asking them about their early experiences. And so you can see how this development will go into riskier behaviors, the higher probability of developing other disorders and diseases, and then very gloomily, early death. We're not going to talk about death. So child maltreatment has a pretty large impact on both brain development and attention. And this is a lot of things that we are focusing on in our lab, which is on the third floor in the other tower. As far as brain development, there's a lot of evidence that there are specific regions of the brain that are impacted by early life experiences. These particular regions are important because of the behaviors that they're associated with. Associative learning and predicting outcomes is important for us taking in information and being able to predict what's going to happen next and generalize the information that we receive to other situations. Our attention to emotion, learning from experiences and predicting probabilities and outcomes from reward and punishment especially, guiding social behaviors, learning from emotional experiences, and our memory in general. All of these behaviors associated with these regions are pretty impactful for social and emotional functioning. Research done in our lab just examined prefrontal cortex volume against life stress and found that the greater life stress that people experience, on the top left there, the smaller prefrontal cortex volume they had. Similarly, the larger prefrontal cortex people have is associated with greater executive functioning, which, as I showed in that model before, is also part of this iterative cycle of general social and emotional functioning, affect bias attention, and then executive attention. Very similar results found in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, and it's actually across the board regardless of type of maltreatment. But children who've been neglected, children who were from low SES families, physically abused, in the amygdala and both the left and right hippocampus showed considerably smaller volumes than comparison samples without those experiences. And we decided to stop going now. So the interesting thing is this actually happens across the board. There are studies that find reduced volume and reduced activity in numerous brain regions associated with social and emotional functioning and the ability to use experiences to guide future behaviors. Now, attention builds off of this. One of the things that I want to look at, and this goes into some of the work that I'm going to be talking about today, is how children identify and perceive emotions. So in this case, what you're looking at is, we're going to call these morphs, and we're going to come back to what that is too. Our lab did a study where we presented children individual pictures of emotional expressions. So I'm going to try to walk through this so you can kind of understand, but each spread here goes from one emotion to another. And so you have the emotion on the left. If you go to the top, those are happy. We can call those full exemplars of happiness. And then they slowly change into fearful. Same thing with happy to sad, angry to fearful, and angry to sad. And then the percentages for the left emotion is on top. So if you're 100% happy, then you're going to be 0% the emotion on the right, in which case that's fearful. And as you go across, then the percentages flip. And this is a morphine software that does use 50% or the correct percentages of each emotional expression. And so the task was showing people these different expressions and asking them to identify them as fearful or happy, happy and sad, and so on. Obviously, when they're full exemplars, it's relatively easy to identify an angry face and a happy face, or a fearful face and a sad face. But as they get into the middle, it gets very difficult. They're ambiguous, they look relatively neutral. This graph shows the performance of identifying these faces. So the y-axis is showing the proportion that the second emotion in each graph is identified. So in the upper right, happy and fear, both control kids and abused kids were, well, and then on the bottom we have the percent fear and the percent sad. So again, it's always the second emotion. And so as you move right in this first half, you're getting more fearful, which also means less happy on the top or less angry on the bottom. And as you get more fearful, you see as you cross that center line, that's the proportion of time they actually identified it as fear. So if we stick with that upper left one, as the face became more fearful, people naturally started identifying it as more fearful. And this didn't differ between controlled or abused kids. Same thing with happy and sad faces. As the face became more sad going to the right, people identified it as more sad. On the bottom, when we start pairing it with anger, is where we see differences. While most kids pretty quickly, in the control group, pretty quickly were able to identify the pictures as fearful as they became more fearful, the abused kids continued to identify those faces as anger well into and past 50%. So the face is now much more fearful than it is angry, but the abused children are still identifying those faces as angry. And this worked also for sadness. And so there's a lot of ways we can look at this, but it shows that in one way, their interpretations of ambiguous facial expressions err towards anger when that's an option. One thought is that in their early environments, they experience a lot more negative emotions, such as anger, than kids from control or typically non-abusive environments. And the ability to identify anger like that is also potentially adaptive for them. In an abusive environment, if anger is going to be predicting harm, it would be helpful to be able to identify that really quickly. And so in empirical studies, we see that that's actually true. And it's not just interpreting ambiguous facial expressions, but we also see that kids who come from abusive environments are also more likely to see many situations resulting in anger. So situations where I think most kids, like receiving a hug, you might consider positive. Kids who've been abused, we're also likely to see that could potentially result in anger as well. Even very neutral situations, such as picking up a coffee mug, to these kids could result in anger. And they also are able to identify anger with very few perceptual cues. So they interpret angry more quickly, they can recognize anger more easily, and they're also predict that anger will be a result of many situations. So this combination of development, social emotional functioning, and recognition is where we have this opportunity for an intervention. What this developmental and cross-cultural research and the idea that this develops from experience shows is that attentional processes are malleable. They're influenced by social experiences. If they can change across development, then the thought is, could this be a possible place of intervention? Is this part of this pathway between early experiences and the development of later, more negative outcomes? And so these interactions are something that I've decided to focus on in projects in our lab in trying to kind of figure this out and tease this apart. So the general model is we know that this early experiences such as child maltreatments impacts emotional biases, which can then have a downstream impact on social functioning and then later health outcomes. And so the attention bias modification is something that might be able to be used as an intervention. The nice thing is that there is some evidence that this works. There's evidence out there right now that interventions such as attention bias modification can be effective in altering individuals' attention to certain information. Attention biases aren't just identified in maltreated kids. Attention biases are identified in people who are anxious, also tend to have this more of a threat bias. So for example, even like a public speaking situation, looking out over the crowd for someone who's very anxious, you would want to focus more on those negative facial expressions because it's going to maintain your anxiety. It's what you're going to be thinking about. Or you're going to be more likely to interpret all of the ambiguous facial expressions as more negative than they really are, again, either causing or maintaining anxiety. Depression is associated with greater attention towards cues of sadness, like sad faces. There's a lot of evidence with people suffering from addiction and evidence of a bias towards cues that can maintain addiction, and same thing for disordered eating. So over the last decade or two, the task that people have been using to identify attention biases and then possibly modify them is called the dot probe. It's a pretty simple task. Two pictures are shown on a screen. One of them is neutral, one of them is angry. Following the display of the pictures, a probe is shown. And then the participant's job is to respond to the location of the probe. In general, just that task alone, if you are orienting more towards one, maybe the angry face, more than the neutral face, you'll be faster to respond to the probe when it shows up behind the angry face versus the neutral face. So the intervention component then just places a contingency on this so that the probe actually shows up more behind the neutral expression than the angry expression. So as you go through the task, if you want to perform optimally, you'll be more likely to look towards the neutral face because you know that's where the probe is coming from. And so participants in this case learn to avoid the threat cues and attend more to the neutral cues. And there is some evidence that these types of tasks have not only changed the way people attend to emotional expressions, but have also shown some reductions in anxiety, depression, and even substance abuse and disordered eating. However, it's a pretty simple task, and there have been somewhat inconsistent results. And what I've also picked up on is this isn't exactly tailored to some of the biases that we were talking about with kids who've been abused. So there have been a newer iteration of this task is designed to alter how people view more ambiguous expressions. So in this one, we're looking at this Morph Continuum again, and it's basically the exact same task that we showed before. How do people identify morphed expressions, especially the more ambiguous ones up front? So this study is one that looked at how juvenile delinquents in a detention center viewed ambiguous expressions that range from, well, happy to angry. And so we see that at baseline, these children tended to judge the happy faces as happy, but those ambiguous faces they're more likely to interpret as angry than happy. And so in this case, the training then is giving people feedback on their response. If they're saying that the faces are, in fact, if we go back, if the faces in the middle are actually happy, especially the ambiguous ones, and they're saying angry, we can give them feedback and say, no, that was incorrect. It was actually a happy face. And we find that, again, this actually does help in improving people's ability to identify faces. So here we have the proportion of angry faces on the left, and at baseline, what we see is this, we can call it balance point, the point at which participants were able to started identifying faces as angry. And so in this case, it's kind of before the ambiguous expressions start. After training, yeah?
What group was this?
This is the juvenile delinquents, yeah, in a detention center. And so we see that after training, it shifted such that those ambiguous facial expressions in the middle were starting to be identified more as happy than they were as angry. And in this particular study, they also found reductions after 2 weeks in staff report aggression. And so it's a study like this that can alter biases, and it worked in anxiety as well, that I feel maps on a little bit better to some of the biases we see in kids that have been abused. So what I wanted to do is take this into an area that hasn't been done before, into kids that have some previous experiences, but have maybe not yet developed some of the psychopathology and some of the issues that we tend to see. And now, unfortunately, we're not quite there yet, but I wanted to show some of the piloting that we've done to get at this, and then some of the efforts that we're making to roll this out into the community. One of the big things that we changed in this task is, instead of asking kids to identify things as angry versus happy, or in this case it's young adults, but as angry versus happy, we asked them to actually rate how angry or happy, so we added an intensity component to it. So thus far what we've done is we had several hundred undergraduates at the university pilot this for us, and we wanted to test this newer paradigm as far as both the efficacy and whether or not we can change biases, which before going out into the community and trying to run children, which I consider to be pretty valuable and I don't want to have to use more than once, we wanted to test the efficacy of the task and then also test how it generalizes. These tasks typically only show people one face. And so people get very good at knowing one individual. And so we need to know if it generalizes to other people. We also need to know if it generalizes to other emotions. Is it a very emotion-specific thing? If you get really good at identifying anger, does that mean that you can also identify other emotions, or does it really stick with anger? But we also wanted to know if it lasts. And so we also had a small group, it was like 40-some people, do several days of training, then we tested them another week later to see if they would last. The way this tasks work is we have a baseline, a training, and then a post-training component. In the baseline, they're seeing faces like this on this continuum. They're seeing 40 of them, and that's actually every increment from a full exemplar of anger to a full exemplar of happiness. And we test where their bias is at baseline. The training component then involves getting feedback for their accuracy. And then the post-training component is the exact same as the baseline, where we can test their performance after training. So the task looks kind of like this. They actually see pictures for 2 seconds. A lot of tasks that use this show pictures very rapidly, which definitely serves a good purpose. But one of the things that I wanted people to do was have a little bit more time to process, so they can really think about what they're looking at. So they see a face, and then they rate it on a bar that kind of looks like this. And they can say, is it a very angry face, very happy face, or they can kind of put it anywhere in between. And then after they respond, they get feedback to see how far off they are. And it actually becomes kind of a game and trying to match up your bar with the bar that comes up afterward. And it's whether it's using perceptual features or actually improving your accuracy. There are some mechanistic things that we're still figuring out. But so far in the task, we found that people actually get pretty good. So we tested people with one model just to see if people looking at one face, let's say this woman, from baseline through training to post-training, if people can improve in identifying this person's, especially the ambiguous emotions. We tested whether it generalized to a different model. So in this case, they were tested at baseline and post-training on one person, but they were trained on a different person. We looked at a different emotion, where they were trained on anger, but they were actually tested at baseline and post-training on fear. We did a control condition where they were asked, I call this a face control. They were asked a different question. They weren't asked how happy or angry, but they were asked how similar is one face to another face, to see if that makes a difference, if maybe just mere exposure of a lot of faces can improve people's accuracy. We also did kind of a random one where people just rated color swatches. So it's percentages of colors going from like green to blue or yellow to red, and rating how much of one color it is. And then we also did the 5 days of training where they actually trained across a week and then had a repeat testing a week later. Some of the numbers that we have, we had different models that we were showing people, so we wanted to make sure that people saw, we wanted to make sure that we had enough people that looked at each face to see if there was a model difference. Obviously these are models that were expressing these emotions, so we wanted to see if there's any differences there. So those are our numbers. These are all, again, kind of intro to psych students, the kind of the typical college students. So what we found that for looking at one model, this is accuracy. If you notice that the scores are negative, the bar can go either more positive from their actual response or it can go more negative. And so what we found is that almost everybody has this negative bias, the tendency to rate faces as more negative, more angry than they actually are across the board. I'll show you in a minute that that's not true for all types of faces and that there is a little bit of a regression, but in general, people were more likely to rate faces as negative than positive. But we found that after training, this did improve and people did become more accurate. And this is after one training. They saw 120 faces. It takes roughly 10 minutes. Accuracy improves. We found that this works for fear as well, and just seeing all fearful faces. We found that in the control condition, where they just saw a bunch of faces but did not receive feedback, we didn't see any improvements. We saw slight improvements when people rated colors, which I thought was kind of interesting. That just rating color swatches actually did slightly improve people's accuracy. It's not significant, but I'm watching these bars though, because that would be one where I'm not sure how to explain that one yet, if that actually works out, that just rating colors can improve your ability to identify facial expressions. But thus far, it's not significant. We found that it generalizes decently to other people, and it didn't matter which way it went, whether you saw a male face and went to a female face, and we had a couple different models. In general, it did generalize to other people. We also found that it generalized to other emotions. So in this case, they were tested on fear, but they were trained on anger in the training component, and that generalized also. So in this case, we found that after one session, people can improve, which is, I think, a strong proof of concept that this task could actually generalize out into other age groups. We found that it generalized to other people, and then also that it's not emotion specific, which I think also can have important implications for social and emotional functioning, and that it's not just that one area of emotional functioning that's impacted. So beyond just whether it's effective, we also wanted to know if these improvements last. So we had people come in, again, for 4 consecutive days, and then we tested them 1 week later. And we found that based on what I thought was actually kind of interesting is baseline to day 1 post-training, we found the improvement, and that's the one I actually already showed you. But then coming back on day 2, almost everybody dropped off. They came back in, they were tested right away, all performance was lost. We give them another training, and we did this for days 2, day 3, and day 4. And we see this slow progression of getting better. And then when we tested them a week later, their improvements that the improvements that they gained still remained. I don't have the data, but I don't know if anybody was thinking about this, but when you run undergraduate students at UW, we also have a pretty large population of Asian students, and I did not have any Asian stimuli. So interestingly, when I look at this same data, Asian students can identify white individuals at the exact same rate by day 5, like this 1 week later. It just takes a lot longer to get there. by day 3 and 4, their performance wasn't quite up to par, but by day 5 it was. And so I find that a little bit interesting, but it also shows, again, this generalization component that even if there's these in-group, out-group biases, with some training and with some time, you can still see improvements. But that one bar, I don't think, fully captures how people are performing, and so I also wanted to look at how they performed across the morph. So what you're looking at here, especially on the tails, is when a face is fully angry versus fully happy. We're looking at accuracy. So in this case, 0 would be perfectly accurate, that they got almost every single one that they saw correct. And if it was above the line, they're rating it more as happy, and if it was below the line, it was more as angry. And so on the tails, they're perfectly correct. And actually, right in the center, right at the very ambiguous faces, they're pretty good too. It's when they were in between and the slightly angry, slightly happy, that we see a little bit of a regression. Whereas the faces were angry, they're more likely to rate them as happy. And when the faces were starting to get a little more happy, people were more likely to rate them as angry. Does that make sense? So, and again, you can see that it's a little bit more heavy towards the angry side. And so this is how people performed on day 1. And this was also our largest group. But as the days went on, we had, well, even just after 1 day of training, we can see this shrink down. The accuracy, it's not just in one spot, but across all of them, they're getting better, and especially the ones that they were considerably worse at in the beginning. And then, as I mentioned before, day 2, you start seeing this come apart again. And then by day 3, and then even day 4, and then finally day 5, they're pretty tight. So if you compare baseline to day 5, across the board, participants are performing very, very good. Except for these kind of slightly happy faces, they're still more negative. One of the interesting parts about this is that this is not an abusive sample. This is not a sample with psychopathology or anything like that. This is a group of generally typically developing college students. And this kind of corresponds back to what I mentioned before, that most people do have this little bit of a negative bias to interpret even happy faces as somewhat negative, which is important to keep in mind as well. So in general, what we found thus far is that this type of training is something that can result in improvements to attention. This can generalize to other identities, and this piloting, I think, is going to be really important as a proof of concept to move an intervention like this into another level. We've seen it work in other types like this with anxiety. We've seen it work in depression. And now I think it's something that we can move into groups that may not be showing some of the problems, such as kids who've been maltreated, that aren't showing the problems that have been used in other interventions. So for us, the next steps is going into the community and testing children. And right now we're establishing partnerships with schools. We're establishing partnerships with community centers to be able to work with kids on kind of a day-to-day basis, to be able to implement a training like this. But beyond that, instead of just moving biases, we also want to know that this translates into something important, that people can also, if they improve in their ability to identify emotional expressions, that it also shows improvements in some sort of social skills, some sort of functioning. And that actually proves to be a little bit tricky. But one of the things we're looking at is what's called a hostile attribution test, and it's how people interpret general situations. This is similar to how we might see a lot of these problems that maltreated kids have. We see these problems manifest in how they interact with peers, how they interpret situations. So I think an example would be if one kid is in the cafeteria and he's carrying a lunch tray and another kid bumps into him. Was that intentional? Was that a hostile act? Was it an accident? And there's evidence that maltreated kids do tend to interpret those as more angry, more hostile, with more intent than kids who haven't been abused. And so it's situations like that that I feel that this could potentially map onto. So a lot of what we talked about is pretty early on what we're doing. We're kind of in a pilot stage, but I thought it'd be kind of nice to share a little bit about where we're going, so you get a little bit of an idea of what's some of the research that we're doing upstairs. And I think, again, just kind of the general recap is looking at the importance of emotion recognition in social functioning, and understanding that although there are genetic predispositions and there are innate abilities to identify emotions, these are things that are heavily learned through experiences. And these experiences also might provide an opportunity for us to provide corrective experience to modify some of these attentional processes to hopefully impact behaviors down the road. And so we're starting to develop those things now. I think I'm done a little bit early, but that's all I have.
I just wanted to get your reflections on, I work in the preschool, and we're doing a lot of this throughout the whole time, but it's a natural, I think, from my observations, bias toward stepping in and doing a lot of modeling and correction for when the emotion perception is one of negativity or the outcome is negative. Such as, oh, look at your friend's face, they look sad, what did you do? Or look at their face, look how mad they are. But we don't spend as much time emphasizing, look how happy they are, or look how, not that we never do that, but there's a little, like you talked about this natural bias toward anger.
Yeah.
And I get why there's a little bit of a survival thing to that.
Absolutely.
But I just wanted your sense of how to be relational in the positive, equally, if not swing toward that, because that's just as an important emotion to realize the things that you're doing are resulting in positive perceptions with your peers.
Yeah. Some of these are getting at that a little bit, in that it's going for accuracy. I shied away a little bit about some of the earlier interventions that I showed because a lot of times it is about avoiding. It's training people to, and it's not even going to positive, but just avoiding threatening cues. One of the issues I had with the group that we're working with, especially if we're talking about maltreated kids, is that avoiding threat. There may be some ethical concerns with training people to avoid something that might be adaptive for them. I find it highly unlikely that computer training in their school is going to generalize to their abilities at home, that they would actually stop identifying anger in threatening contexts. I find that highly unlikely. I would love for these paradigms to be that strong, but I find that unlikely. And I think learning theory also supports that there's a strong contextual component to that, so I don't think that would actually transfer to a threatening environment. But one of the things that, when thinking about both this adaptive component and many of the other paradigms that are avoiding threat, that's why I wanted to go in a slightly different direction that didn't direct people one way or another, but tried to promote accuracy. Because I think accuracy is something that is going to be important for these peer relationships. And I think you're totally right, and we don't emphasize it very often. But identifying how happy someone is and responding appropriately is equally as important as far as maintaining and establishing relationships as it is to identify and respond to someone who's angry. Yeah. Yeah.
So, given this hypothesis that being able to accurately identify emotion is important for social relations, have you had a chance to look at individual differences in your sample of maltreated kids to see if kids who just naturally are more skilled at social recognition have better outcomes?
I haven't had a chance to look at that yet. It's definitely true that just because a kid experiences maltreatment, that doesn't mean they're going to go on and develop all these things. You know, we show all these graphs about all the negative things that happen when you experience these things. That's not always true. And there are a lot of reasons that people might not go on to develop those issues. And that probably would be important. One of the hopes was that with an intervention like this is it shouldn't matter, because I feel that providing something like this for anybody is a good thing. But I do think there probably are people who are skilled, and I think I tried to do this with the undergraduate sample, and it didn't work out. But I administered some social skills questionnaires to see how skilled people were in social situations, how that impacted their ability, either their baseline biases or their ability to change as a result of training. I picked the wrong questionnaires. I don't know. It didn't work out. There is no associations between people's social functioning and any performance on any of these tasks with the questionnaires that I administered. So I do think there's probably something to that, and that certain people will have some abilities that will make them just better at some of these things. And my my thought would be that if that's true, those are some of the individuals who would be less likely to go on to develop some of these other issues. Right now, interventions for kids that have gone through early life stress are basically formed around the idea of establishing safe, secure, nurturing relationships, whether it's family, friends, mentors, trying to get people those types of environments. And if you have some kids who've gone through this but have the ability to form those relationships on their own, they're likely, I would think, to not develop all those problems. And that could be a buffering component, which is something that if it was related to some of these measures, this could be an identification tool where those who have extreme biases may be less likely to have the skills to do that. I think that could be really interesting. Yeah.
Are there any similar studies with profession-based, where you might need to have that skill of quickly being able to identify a facial expression, military or social work, police?
So there's definitely bias training, and they do that with police officers.
But as far as their ability to recognize subtle changes.
I don't know, and I don't know exactly how they would transfer. I know that they've actually done kind of an opposite of what I showed here. This whole threat avoidance of threat with the dot probe. They've actually done the opposite of that with military members who are going into a combat zone. Because in those cases, they actually find that people who are orienting more towards threat are less likely to develop PTSD. I think there's some expectation things to that. And so I don't have the citation for that, but they've done studies where they try to train people to orient towards threat when they're going to go into a setting like that. I think that actually comes back around to the maltreated kids and how adaptive a bias like that can be in certain settings. And so you have a contextual congruence thing that if you have a bias towards threat, if you're in a threatening environment, that's going to be great, and it's going to help you. It's going to help you adapt to the situation and potentially recover afterwards. It's when you have a bias towards threat in a non-threatening situation is when you can start having some problems. That's a good question. I don't know.
I just wondered too, your slides showing early life stressors or maltreatment, or even if it isn't intentional maltreatment, just early stressors, and we talk a lot about trauma-informed practice and brain volume. Looking at the correlations between if a child is having early life experiences that are again not necessarily intentional but certainly stressful from a socioeconomic consistency, homelessness, etc., and that leads to potentially lower brain volume in these key areas of the brain. Do you have a sense of where in there is, even if the situation changes, where does the brain volume issue, assuming you don't just add brain volume later, where does that become a factor you can't completely accommodate for anymore? Or is it not looked at it that way?
So are you asking whether it's something that can be remediated with brain volume?
In my experience, sometimes you have a person who clearly has early life stressors.
Yep.
Clearly. And then there's very real and valid attempts to form these safe and secure and nurturing relationships.
Yep.
But there's persisting difficulties and problems. And while you're certainly not saying, well, throw your hands up, forget working on safe, secure relationships, you kind of have this wondering sense about you if there is innate changes that have happened that are leading to really significant difficulties despite attempting really good intervention, because there's already been process changes in the brain that...
So basically, if something happens, to what extent is it hopeless? We don't want to say that, but... I don't want to say hopeless as much as where are there innate factors you can't go back and change? So... You simply try to buffer, buoy up, but you can't go back and change. So I think the direction that I'd have with that is that in a sample of neglected kids, there's a project called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project, and this is in Bucharest, Romania, where they randomly assigned children in Romania to receive high-quality foster care versus stay in an orphanage. There's a lot of kids in orphanages there, where the providers are great, but the caregiver-to-child ratio is very, very, very high. The other way around, child-to-caregiver ratio is very, very high. And so there's a lot of neglect, institutional neglect in these kids. And what they did is they had kids in these orphanages, and they randomly assigned some of them to leave and some of them stay. And it's not my project, so I'm not going to get into any of the other details with that, but you can certainly look it up. What they found is that with getting taken out, the earlier the better. So the earlier you can intervene, the better the results are. And that with high-quality interventions, you can get a lot of improvement. But they did find that even after a decade of being removed, some of these kids didn't improve in every domain. Some domains remained resistant, and the kids on the whole still did have some problems. And that's tricky from an interventional standpoint. It's still worthwhile, and it still goes a long way. But you're right that there are some, I think, intractable issues and it just shows the importance and what the extreme impact of some of these experiences. And so I think that's probably the best example I've seen that has tried to address that, and looking longitudinally at some of those interventions. You want to end on that sad note, do you?
So you said when you were testing the college students that there was some issues. It took a while, I guess, for the Asian students to catch up on that. Is that related to what you were talking about with the eyes versus the mouth? They had to kind of learn.
That's a good question.
What we were looking for.
It could be. It totally could be. I haven't put a lot of thought into it, but it totally could be. I think my more superficial thought was that the in-group, out-group bias is pretty strong, and our ability to identify emotions in other cultures tends to be pretty poor, just because of that. But I think that's actually a great thought, that it could very well be just that they're looking at different facial expressions. You'd have to look at the composition of the faces to see how much that might matter. But if you remember, I kept showing that one woman. She had an extreme mouth, like she just scowling mouth. And for overt mouth expressions like that, yeah, maybe that does impact it, especially if there's a subset of people who are relying more heavily on eyes and less on mouths, possibly. Yeah. Yeah, when you get close up, she's quite the actress. She gets kind of crazy. Yeah.
Did everybody get a chance to sign in on that board? Any other questions?
I have one more question about the intervention you did with the university students. Did it generalize to, I know you said to different faces and emotions. Did you do a different face and a different emotion? Just wondering, because the picture showed like a
Yeah. No, I did not.
Okay.
No, we didn't. With that one, we didn't want to change too many variables at once.
Right.
No, that'd be interesting. I mean, I think it's a good start. But I think you're right. There are a lot more variables and a lot of other things that could change that may or may not impact generalization. But no, I haven't looked at that. That's a good idea.
Has there been any studies that look at kind of what you were trying to hit at with the survey of how people are then interpreting emotions in real life?
That's a really hard thing to measure. So the studies that have been doing that are usually looking at symptomatology, and that's something that I've been really interested in, is trying to figure out how these abilities transfer into the real world. And so usually people are looking at performance in schools. So the juvenile delinquents, they're looking at aggression reported by staff members. Or there was another study that was done looking at people's ability to identify fear, and then they had teachers report some of their behaviors. But other than just general report, I haven't seen a lot of it. And one of the reasons that I don't go down that road is for a training like this, if you imagine there's a 2-week training and you go into a classroom and you ask teachers to rate all their kids based on their behaviors, from your own personal experience, how much would it take for you to change your opinion about that kid, even if it was happening, and to change your opinion about another person? If you meet somebody who's kind of a jerk, what would it take for you to then say, no, he's not a jerk anymore? Or he's much less of a jerk than he was. I think that takes a lot, and I don't know if a training like this over a week or two would quite get there. And so I want to try to find something that we can more quantifiably measure that's actually some of their skills. And so the start right now is this idea of analyzing social situations. And so they're not actually interpreting emotion, but they're interpreting intent in a social situation. And that was kind of one of the transfers I was looking at. But even then, it's still going to be a laboratory administered situation. We're going to be showing them the scenarios, not something that's happening in the real world. So it's still not quite to a perfect transfer. And I don't know of any studies that have really gave me compelling evidence that there's really good transfer to that yet, but it's getting there. If you have any ideas, let me know.
All right, well, thank you for presenting for us today, and thank you guys for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.